Roger, we copy.
Pretty good total job.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
The whole world was watching, waiting for his story. But Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, didn't want to talk about it. He became the most famous person on Earth, yet he turned down millions of dollars, refused interviews, and simply walked away. It looked like humility, but those who knew him whispered it was something darker. A secret pain followed him into space and back home again. So what was the shocking truth he was hiding? This is the real story of the moon landing's greatest mystery, and the heavy price one man paid for immortality. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon in July 1969, billions of people on Earth leaned toward their screens, waiting for every word.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
He delivered a single line that would be remembered for generations, but then he turned away from the camera, calm, short, and almost cold. After the mission ended, the world wanted more. Interviews, memoirs, speeches, endorsements, but Armstrong walked in the opposite direction. He rejected the chance to become a celebrity, refused millions in book and movie deals, and chose to live quietly in Ohio. This choice created a mystery bigger than the mission itself. Why would the man who carried the hopes of humanity to the moon decide to hide from the spotlight? Most astronauts of his era embraced fame, traveling the world, writing their stories, and building careers from their glory. Yet Armstrong seemed almost allergic to attention. He granted very few interviews, and when he did, his answers were short, cautious, and stripped of emotion. People who met him outside NASA described him as polite but distant, a man who never seemed fully present in social settings. Even at public events, Armstrong often stood on the side, letting others speak, and when the press chased him, he disappeared into the background like a shadow. The paradox is sharp. Here was a man who carried out the most daring act of the century, yet refused to be the face of it. That silence became his shield, and at the same time, his most haunting secret. It was not only modesty, it was something deeper, something that cut into his private life and shaped the way he looked at the world. The more people tried to celebrate him, the more he pulled back, as if fame itself was a threat. His neighbors in Ohio recalled how Armstrong never boasted about his mission. Some said they did not even know he was the first man on the moon until years later. Unlike other heroes, he did not want statues or honors. He wanted space to breathe, far from the endless questions. This strange distance has fueled speculation for decades. Was he hiding disappointment, fear, or regret? Or was there a personal wound so deep that no amount of metals could heal it? Armstrong's silence was not empty. It was full of meaning, full of weight, and full of things left unsaid. And it leaves us with the unsettling feeling that his greatest mystery was never on the moon but within himself. So what could have driven the first man on the moon to turn his back on fame, and why did his silence matter more than his words? The answer begins not with the astronaut, but with the quiet boy from Ohio who could never stop looking at the sky. Neil Armstrong's journey to the moon began not with rockets but with a restless boy in Ohio who could not take his eyes off the sky. Born in 1930 in the small town of Wapakoneta, Neil grew up in the shadow of the Great Depression, yet his childhood was filled with endless curiosity about airplanes. His father took him to the Cleveland air races when he was only 2 years old, and from that day the noise of engines and the sight of aircraft cutting through the clouds became a permanent part of his imagination. By the time he was 6, Armstrong was already riding in planes, and at age 15, while most boys his age were still learning how to drive cars, Neil was learning how to fly. He mowed lawns, cleaned yards, and worked odd jobs just to pay for lessons at the local airfield, showing the determination that would define his life. He earned his pilot's license before he even had a driver's license, a fact that stunned his teachers and peers and set him apart from everyone around him. Flying became more than a skill. It was his personal sanctuary. When he was in the air, the noise of the world faded, and he felt a control and calm that he rarely showed on the ground. Classmates remembered him as quiet, polite, and reserved, the kind of boy who would sit apart and sketch aircraft in his notebook instead of joining loud conversations. He never tried to be the center of attention, and even in high school, he seemed to carry a distance that kept him separated from others. That distance was not coldness, but a focus on something bigger than the world he saw every day. Teachers noticed that Armstrong was not only skilled in mechanics, but also precise.
I was amazed to find out this, what looked like a young kid in front of me, had 1,500 hours of jet.
Almost perfectionist when it came to mathematics and science. Every number had to make sense. Every diagram had to be exact, and this precision would later help him when the stakes were life or death. By the time he entered Purdue University to study aeronautical engineering, Armstrong was already seen as a boy destined for the sky. He attended on a Navy scholarship, which meant that his dream of flying would soon become reality in the most demanding way possible. But even then, he kept the same personality he had as a child. Serious, calm, and always slightly removed, as if part of him was already far above the earth. The early years in Ohio shaped him into someone who could look past noise and chaos and find focus in the middle of pressure. This quiet boyhood explains why Armstrong never seemed to crave recognition or glory. His true reward came when he was in the air, alone with the hum of the engine. It also explains why, even as the world later tried to place him at the center of history, he never really felt at home on stage. The roots of his silence were already planted long before Apollo 11, and they grew out of the soil of a childhood where flight mattered more than fame. But if the boy from Ohio had been shaped by peace and study, what would happen when that same young man was thrown into the fire of war and faced death in the skies of Korea? The quiet boy from Ohio did not stay in the classroom for long because the Navy soon called him into the fire of the Korean War. At only 20, Armstrong was flying combat missions in a jet fighter over dangerous skies where survival was never guaranteed. On one mission, his plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire and torn apart, yet Armstrong stayed calm, guiding the damaged jet back across enemy lines before ejecting at the last moment. He landed in a rice paddy, far from safety, but he managed to escape and return to base. It was the kind of event that could have broken a young pilot, but for Armstrong, it only showed his unusual ability to stay cold under pressure. That calm became his trademark, and it followed him into the world of test pilots where the risks were even higher. After the war, Armstrong flew the legendary X-15, a rocket-powered plane designed to touch the edge of space. These flights pushed men and machines to their limits, and every second carried the possibility of disaster. On one mission, Armstrong overshot his landing site by miles, bouncing across the desert in a craft moving too fast for comfort, yet he brought it back without panic. Colleagues started to notice that Armstrong had something rare, a mental space where fear never seemed to enter. They called it the Armstrong Zone, a place where his mind stayed cool and sharp even as death circled close. This strange inner space was tested again in 1966 when Armstrong commanded Gemini 8. What began as a smooth mission suddenly turned into a nightmare when a thruster stuck open, sending the spacecraft into a violent spin. Inside, Armstrong and fellow astronaut Dave Scott were tossed around as the capsule spun faster and faster, like a washing machine in space. Their vision blurred, their bodies were close to blacking out, and the situation was seconds away from killing them both. But Armstrong kept his focus, shut down the main controls, and used backup thrusters to steady the craft. It was one of the most dangerous emergencies in early spaceflight, yet Armstrong brought the ship under control and guided it safely back to Earth. That moment proved what many already suspected, that Armstrong's ability to think clearly under extreme stress was unmatched. The Armstrong Zone was not just a nickname, it was the reason NASA trusted him with the most critical missions. Still, this gift came with a cost, because the same cold focus that saved his life also created distance from people who expected emotion. Friends admired his bravery, but some felt he was almost unreachable, locked inside that private zone where nothing seemed to touch him. This paradox shaped both his career and his personal life. Because the qualities that made him perfect for the cockpit also made him hard to know as a man. And as the missions grew riskier, the line between professional calm and personal silence began to blur. So if Armstrong could stay unshaken while facing fire in Korea, test flights on the edge of space, and a spacecraft spinning out of control, what kind of storm could finally break through that silence? For all the danger Neil Armstrong faced in the skies, nothing compared to the battle he fought on the ground when his little daughter fell sick. Karen, whom the family lovingly called Muffy, was born in 1959, bringing joy to Neil and his wife Janet. But before her second birthday, doctors discovered something devastating, an inoperable brain tumor known as DIPG. At the time, medicine had almost no answers for such a diagnosis, and the young parents were told their child would not live long. Armstrong, who could control machines at the edge of space, now faced something he could not fix. Neil responded the only way he knew, by studying the illness with the same discipline he applied to flight. He kept detailed notes of every treatment, tracked symptoms, and researched medical studies, as if careful observation could change the outcome. Janet later remembered that Neil seemed determined to fight the tumor with logic, but underneath his calm face, she saw a man carrying unbearable pain. For the first time, the strong pilot looked powerless. As the months passed, Muffy's condition grew worse. She lost strength, struggled to speak, and slowly slipped away before her parents' eyes. On January 28, 1962, Karen died, and the date cut even deeper because it was also Neil and Janet's wedding anniversary. The loss hit like a silent explosion. Janet recalled, "He cried once, then he stopped, and I never saw him cry again." That single moment of grief was the last time Armstrong allowed himself to break in public. From then on, he built an invisible wall around his emotions. Friends noticed the change. He became quieter, more private, and even more distant than before. At work, he buried himself in assignments, returning to the airfield almost immediately after the funeral. He did not talk about Muffy with colleagues, and even inside his home, the subject remained locked away. For Armstrong, silence became both armor and prison. Yet traces of his grief surfaced in small, hidden ways. During the Apollo missions, he named a crater on the moon Muffy's Crater, a tribute known only to a few. It was his way of carrying her memory into the heavens, placing her name among the stars he had always chased. This act showed how deeply she remained with him, even if he never spoke the words aloud. The tragedy also placed great strain on his marriage. Janet wanted to share her feelings, but Neil's way of coping was withdrawal, and that gap slowly grew wider over the years. Where most families might seek comfort in conversation, the Armstrongs learned to live with silence filling the space between them. Colleagues admired Neil's discipline, but they rarely understood that it was born from heartbreak. His calm was not just a natural talent, but also a shield forged in grief, protecting him from breaking down again. The death of Muffy shaped everything that came after. When Armstrong faced emergencies in space, he could remain cold and precise because he had already lived through the worst loss a parent can imagine. This tragedy did not make him fearless. It made him someone who carried his fear in silence. And it explains why, when the world later crowned him a hero, he seemed untouched by the celebration. He had already paid a price that glory could never balance. But if the pain of losing a child pushed Armstrong further into silence, how did the vast emptiness of space become the one place where he could finally find some form of release? After the loss of his daughter, Armstrong found no peace on Earth, so he threw himself into work with an intensity that worried even his colleagues. He took on missions that few others wanted, the kind that pushed the limits of both man and machine. The cockpit became his refuge, a place where control was absolute, and every movement of his hand had a direct result. It was the opposite of the helplessness he felt while watching Muffy's illness, and in that control, he found a strange kind of relief. The Gemini 8 mission in 1966 showed this clearly. When the spacecraft began spinning wildly, Armstrong's pulse barely rose above normal. Medical data later revealed that while most people would have panicked and blacked out, his heart rate stayed steady, proof that he could command his body even as death closed in. NASA engineers said they trusted him more after that incident because he had shown that his calm was not an act, but a core part of who he was. Other astronauts admired him, but also called him distant. describing him as a man who carried an invisible barrier into space. For Armstrong, that barrier was not arrogance but survival, a way to separate emotion from duty. When Apollo 11 came, the stakes reached heights no pilot had ever faced. As the lunar module dropped toward the surface, alarms blared, and the fuel supply shrank to seconds. Armstrong took manual control, guided the fragile craft past dangerous boulders, and touched down with less than 30 seconds of fuel left. Inside Mission Control, engineers were sweating through their shirts, yet Armstrong's voice over the radio was calm, almost flat. It was the sound of a man who had trained himself to hide everything but focus. His famous words on the moon carried history, but his tone carried restraint, as if even that moment of triumph had to be held at a distance. Other astronauts later said Armstrong seemed most alive not during the speeches or parades, but when he was back with the machines, talking with engineers, solving technical problems, and living in the world of precision. This pattern shows that space was not just a career, it was his chosen escape, a place where pain could not reach him. The stars gave him freedom from the memories that Earth could not let him forget. In the silence of space, he could hear only the hum of systems he controlled, not the echoes of a loss he could never undo. That is why Armstrong's story is not only about exploration, but also about a man searching for peace in the most hostile environment known to humanity. Yet even victories in space could not protect him forever from the weight of history and the pressure of fame waiting when he returned home. So what price did Armstrong pay for becoming a global symbol? And how did that fame slowly break apart the private life he tried to guard? Apollo 11 was more than a mission. It was the climax of the space race, the gamble of an entire nation against the Soviet Union. The pressure was so high that President Richard Nixon had a speech prepared called "In Event of Moon Disaster," ready to be read to the world if the astronauts were stranded or killed on the lunar surface. That detail alone shows the weight carried by Armstrong as he guided the first landing, because success would bring glory, but failure would have been mourned as a global tragedy. When he returned to Earth, Armstrong instantly became the most famous man alive. He was invited to parades in dozens of countries, met heads of state, and was praised as the ultimate symbol of human achievement. But instead of enjoying the spotlight, he seemed to shrink away from it. He rejected book deals, movie contracts, and endorsements worth millions, decisions that baffled people who thought he could have built a second career on his name. Armstrong instead chose to retreat to Ohio, teaching engineering at the University of Cincinnati and living far from the noise of Hollywood or Washington. Even in the classroom, he rarely spoke about Apollo 11, treating it like just another assignment rather than the defining event of the century. His refusal to embrace fame created tension at home as well. The marriage that had survived war, test flights, and tragedy began to break under the weight of his distance. Janet, who had carried the family during his years in space, grew frustrated with a husband who was physically present but emotionally removed. After nearly 40 years together, the couple divorced, a painful reminder that being a global icon did not mean success at home. Armstrong's son later described him as both present and absent at the same time, a father who was there in body but often unreachable in spirit. This strange duality was the real cost of history, because Armstrong had given everything to a single moment and seemed unable to return to ordinary life afterward. The irony is that while his face appeared on stamps and textbooks, the man himself grew increasingly hidden, known less as a person and more as a legend carved out of stone. For many, that made him even more mysterious, a hero who had become untouchable. But was this distance simply the result of fame, or was it the silence of a man still carrying private wounds that no metal could heal? The answer lies not in the parades or classrooms, but in the rare, quiet moments where the true Neil Armstrong finally appeared. For decades, people searched for the hidden side of Neil Armstrong, but the truth may not lie in documents or private confessions. The real secret was his silence. He lived most of his life behind a wall of reserve, letting very little escape, and that quiet became the clearest window into who he really was. There is rare footage that shows Armstrong in a NASA lab, laughing with engineers, pointing at machines, and speaking with the ease of a man at home. It is one of the few moments where his guard drops, and for a brief time, he is not a statue, but a colleague, relaxed and alive. A fellow engineer once said, "That was the real Neil. When there were no cameras, when he was with the people who built the spacecraft, he could finally be himself." This glimpse is powerful because it suggests Armstrong was never hiding arrogance or fear, but protecting the part of himself that only felt safe among machines and trusted friends. In public, he stayed careful and measured, almost rehearsed, but in private, his smile revealed that silence was not emptiness, it was a choice. That choice came at a heavy cost. By locking away grief, he carried memories that never found release. By refusing fame, he missed chances to shape his own story. And by living with so much distance, he sometimes stood apart from the very people who loved him most. The silence was both his armor and his burden, making him one of history's most famous men, yet also one of its loneliest. When he died in 2012, tributes poured in from every corner of the world. Leaders called him a hero, astronauts named him a teacher, and ordinary people remembered the thrill of watching him step onto another world. But among all the praise, there was also a quiet recognition that no one ever fully knew him. Even his closest friends admitted that Armstrong remained a mystery. A man who gave the world a moment of unity but kept his private world locked away. That paradox is what makes his legacy so haunting. He gave humanity its greatest leap, yet he bore the weight of loss and silence alone. The price of history was not only his privacy, but his chance to live as an ordinary man. In the end, Armstrong's greatest secret was that his life was not defined by glory, but by the things he never said. The walls he built were not to keep people out, but to hold his pain in. And that pain became part of the legend, shaping the way the world remembers him. Today, when we look at the footprint on the moon, we see more than just a symbol of human progress. We see the mark of a man who carried his deepest wound into the stars, leaving us to wonder if greatness is worth the silence it demands. So the question remains, was the first step on the moon a triumph of mankind? Or was it also the moment one man gave up the chance to live a life free from shadows? Neil Armstrong gave humanity an immortal moment when he placed the first footprint on the moon. But behind the glory, he lived a quiet life, carrying the pain of losing his daughter and the weight of fame he never asked for. His story reminds us that glory always has a price, and sometimes that price is the chance to live a normal life that every person longs for. The deepest lesson is this: history remembers the moments, but it rarely shows the hidden sacrifices behind them. And that leaves us wondering, how many untold secrets lie behind the greatest heroes in history? What did they have to give up in order to change the world forever?